I've got the 1/24 scale Firebird drift build back on the bench. I was able to take this vehicle for a test drive, which I showed in a previous video, and all in all, I was very pleased with how the car performed. Although there's certainly a lot of room for improvement in terms of handling and drifting, being such a unique and experimental build, I was just happy to see the car functioning as well as it did. As I discussed a bit in the last video, I'm going to be doing a complete suspension and drivetrain overhaul on this car. Although the majority of these new parts may look identical to the previous parts I was using, these feature a lot of subtle but important improvements that should have a dramatic impact on the performance of the car. I'll talk a bit more about the improvements I've made to certain components as I install them. I started with the front struts. As I had mentioned when I installed these before, these struts mounted to the underside of the body are more of just a temporary placeholder. I've got an idea for what I believe will be a much better upper strut mount setup. This new upper strut mount design will require some modifications to the body, and the current upper strut mounts will need to be removed. I've now got a nice flat surface to install the new upper strut mounts. I next begin removing all of the suspension and drivetrain components from the chassis, starting with the rear axle. Now that I'm left with just the bare chassis, I wanted to remove any rough spots from where I cut sections of the model kit's chassis piece in order to make room for the suspension components. I cut a small piece of styrene to patch up a section of the radiator mount. As I mentioned before, the heat from the motor was causing the motor mount piece to bend a bit, so I will be installing a new motor mount. The new rear axle housing I'm using incorporates a place to mount a torque arm, which will eliminate the axle twist. I needed to make some modifications to the chassis in order to make room for the torque arm. With this little bit of trimming and sanding, I should now have ample space for the torque arm. I will ensure this is the case by test fitting everything before I paint the chassis. I made a few minor modifications to the front K-member piece and control arms. The control arms move very smoothly and their travel has been limited. Although all these parts look good as is, I wanted to give them a coat of matte black paint to better match the color of the chassis. Once the paint was dry, I was ready to begin assembling the rear suspension and axle assembly. I started by assembling the trailing arms. I used the old trailing arms as a reference and cut the steel rods to the correct length. After ensuring that each rod was the same length, I glued the trailing arm ends to the rods. I then press fit the socket end of the trailing arms onto the rear axle housing and ensure that they are moving smoothly. I decided to reuse the screws from before to mount the other end of the trailing arm. The new rear axle incorporates several improvements, the biggest being that it's now one solid rod with the ring gear solidly mounted to it, so there's no worries about a differential acting up like before. Also, the hubs are thicker, making them slightly stronger. I first installed the pinion gear, and then placed the axle into the housing, making sure that the gears were well lubricated. I then installed the 8 screws that hold the two halves of the axle assembly together, being careful not to strip any of the heads. The axle rotates smoothly as it should. Here I'm installing the torque arm mount. After verifying that there will be enough room for the torque arm, I moved on to test fitting the motor mount. This new motor mount, which incorporates a mount for the torque arm, isn't going to fit due to the chassis transmission crossmember being in the way. I started by removing material with a rotary tool and file to see if I could get enough clearance. It pretty quickly became apparent that this crossmember is going to need to be removed to allow enough space for the torque arm mount. So I cut it out using some side cutters and then began trimming and sanding the remaining sections until it was smooth, so I would have a nice place to mount a new crossmember that sits lower. At this point, I went ahead and assembled the motor mount and gear assembly. As I mentioned before after driving the car, the heat from the motor caused the previous motor mount to bend slightly. Although I'm using the same motor mount design, made in the same material as before, I'm placing some spacers in between the motor and the mount. I'm not sure if this is going to be enough to prevent the heat from affecting the motor mount, but I'm curious to see if this will work. Other than the spacers, this motor mount goes together the exact same way as before. I wanted to test fit the new motor mount assembly so I can figure out how low I need to make the new crossmember. After taking some measurements, I cut out a piece of styrene to the correct size and shape. After a little bit of sanding around the edges, I glued the piece in place. While it was drying, I mounted the body to the chassis in preparation for mounting the axle. With the body in place, it'll be easier to determine where the axle needs to be placed so that the wheels are in the center of the wheel wells. After making sure that the axle is centered and aligned, I mark its position. I then applied some glue to the trailing arm mounts and secure them to the chassis piece. I next install the panhard bar mount, making sure that it is at the correct angle. After that, I installed the front K-member assembly. At this point, I was getting ready to repaint the chassis piece. To make the undercarriage look a bit more realistic, I decided to remove the raised lettering visible on the back. This was very easy to do just by scraping the surface with a knife and then using some sandpaper to smooth it out. I also wanted to do the necessary sanding and cutting to the new crossmember so that the motor mount assembly will fit. Because the plastic was getting thin, I glued a second piece below the spot where I was removing material. After a bit of sanding and cutting, I was able to get everything to fit. I also sanded some of the edges smooth on the new crossmember to give it a little better appearance. With everything else sanded, I used some compressed air and a cloth to wipe away any dust before I start painting. I began brushing on some Model Master's acrylic flat black paint. I wasn't concerned about brush strokes being visible or the difference between the two colors since this is the underside of the car. As it turned out though, this color almost perfectly matched what had already been painted. After allowing the paint to dry, I started working on the panhard bar. I started by gluing one end of the rod and loosely mounting it in place, and then marking where I wanted to cut it. After grinding it down to the exact length, I tested it one last time, and then glued the other end and mounted the panhard bar. Although it is still at a tad bit of an angle, it's much better than before and will function well. I trimmed the springs a little bit since the ride height before was a little bit too high. I made sure not to remove too much though, since I don't want to set the exact ride height until I have the interior and everything else installed. I printed out a bunch of new parts that, although look very similar to the previous ones, they incorporate a lot of minor tweaks and changes, especially the steering components. After doing a bit of sanding, I painted some of the components such as the brake rotors. As I mentioned before, I'm doing something a little bit different with the upper strut mount. In the last video, I made some modifications to the body that allow for this new upper strut mount design to be mounted. I did my best to design this part so that it would match the size and shape of the surface that it is being mounted to. I also wanted to incorporate a strut bar that will help with the alignment and provide a bit of reinforcement. I started by using a sphere to represent the top of the strut and worked my design around that. After getting these parts printed, I installed the struts and test fitted them to the car. They fit great, though just barely touched the top of the hood, so I did a little bit of sanding so that they would sit slightly lower. The left side strut mount needed to be sanded a bit so that it would fit around the brake master cylinder that's molded into the body. I did a bit more sanding to the body so that the mounts would sit flat. I next worked on the strut bar. I secured one end of the rod to the strut mount and marked the position of where I needed to cut the rod on the other end. After the rod was the correct length, I glued each end. I then glued each upper strut mount to the body. After the paint had dried on the front wheel mounts, I glued the magnets in place. I then assembled the front knuckles and steering linkage. Next, I cut the new strut rods to the correct length and glued them to the knuckle. As of making this video, I'm in the process of making some design improvements to these knuckles, since getting the strut rod aligned properly on these is a bit difficult. With the knuckles mounted to the lower control arms, I moved on to mounting the steering arms. Before mounting the servo arm to the servo, I made sure that the servo was centered. I noticed that the motor was very close to a couple of edges on the chassis, so I did a little bit of trimming to increase the clearance. After that, I started working on the torque arm. First making sure that the metal rod was cut to the correct length, and then I glued the end piece. I then mounted that end to the motor mount assembly. I noticed that the nut was coming in contact with the chassis, so I needed to remove a bit of material in order to make enough room for it. After doing so, I used a little bit more of that flat black paint to paint over the white areas before securing the motor mount. While I had the paint out, I also painted the drive shaft. Finally, I installed the motor mount and drive shaft and did a quick test to make sure everything is working properly. With everything functioning as it should, I mounted the body to the chassis. The Firebird is coming together great, and I can't wait to see how it performs with these new parts. There's still a few minor things I need to do before I can drive the car, but it's getting very close to being ready. After doing a little bit of driving to confirm that everything is functioning correctly, I wanted to test fit the body to see how well the suspension is aligned and positioned in relation to it. In order to make sure that the body was properly positioned, I needed to secure the front and rear bumper pieces, which I did using a little bit of tape. After the body was properly positioned to the chassis, I took a look at both sides of the vehicle to see how the wheels were aligned in relation to the wheel wells, and in the case of the rear wheels, to see if they evenly stuck out on each side. As you've probably noticed, the rear wheels are sticking out much further than the front wheels. I put larger hubs with several millimeters of spacing on the rear axle. I will be spacing out the front wheels some as well to give the car a wider stance. I also checked to see how well the fender flares look with the wheels spaced out this far. I think I'm going to move the rear tires in just a little bit, but I'm really digging the look of this wider stance. One minor thing that I noticed is that the left side wheel seems to be sticking out slightly further than the right wheel. This is not a problem though, since I can simply compensate for this by shortening the panhard bar. In addition to pushing the wheels in a bit, I'm also going to be lowering the rear and fitting some wider wheels with more back spacing as well, since I think the current ones look a bit too narrow, especially when they're spaced out like they are here. As for the front suspension, I think that the front wheels sit slightly too far back in the wheel wells, so I have adjusted the design of the lower control arms and printed them out. I also designed and printed some improved steering knuckles. I think I may also need to do a little bit of trimming in a few areas around the wheel wells, just so the wheels don't rub when turned sharply, but aside from that, the front suspension is looking and functioning great. I've also been doing a lot of brainstorming about what I want to do cosmetically to the car. Although I haven't completely decided on what I want to do yet, I'm definitely going to be going with more of a rough look. I plan on keeping the car in primer since I really like the way it's layered, and I may try to work a little bit of magic with an airbrush to give the car more of a weathered and grimy look. Maybe even throw in a few dents and some scrapes as well. I've got a pretty solid plan for what I want to do to the interior and how I want to go about designing the roll cage, so I plan on beginning work on that very soon.